In a courtroom, the weight of judgment doesn't just fall on the shoulders of the defendant. It extends to everyone in the room, shaping their roles and the way they're perceived. But what happens when the assumptions made about someone are completely wrong? What happens when a powerful figure is underestimated, and their quiet presence holds more strength than anyone could ever imagine? Imagine this: a white judge, powerful in his authority, sitting high in his seat, looking down at the defendant before him. The air is tense, as it often is in courtrooms, but this moment is different. The judge, with all his years of experience and his ingrained assumptions, ridicules the black woman standing before him. The way she dresses, the way she speaks, her very presence is met with skepticism. He makes quick judgments, thinking her role in the courtroom is minor, that she doesn't hold any real power. After all, how could someone like her be anything more than what he sees in front of him? But what the judge doesn't know, what he could never have predicted, is that this woman who stands silently, unwavering in her composure, is not just any defendant. She is, in fact, a federal prosecutor, one of the most powerful figures in the room. Her identity is masked not just by her race, but by the stereotypes that cling to her. And that's where the tension begins, between perception and reality, between the biases we hold and the truth that is often hidden beneath the surface. The stakes are high here, not just for the woman, whose professionalism and expertise are called into question, but for the judge as well. What will it take for him to realize that the power he assumes lies in his position of authority is not always where he expects it? What will it cost him to learn that the strength of character, the quiet confidence of those he underestimates, has the power to shift the course of justice? The courtroom, as we know, is a space for truth, but it is also a battleground for respect and dignity. As this story unfolds, we are drawn into the conflict between stereotypes and individual potential, between the limited assumptions of a judge and the broad, unrecognized authority of a woman who is about to prove him, and everyone else, wrong. Stay with us as we peel back the layers of this story, revealing the shocking moments of discovery and transformation that will leave you questioning not just the judge's actions, but our society's deepest biases and assumptions. In the quiet of the courtroom, the air was thick with the weight of judgment, not just from the bench, but in the subtle undercurrents of bias that permeated every interaction. The judge, a white man with decades of experience, sat high above, draped in the authority his position granted him. But in that moment, his authority was clouded by something far more insidious: prejudice. He assumed he knew who the woman standing before him was. In his mind, he had already decided her worth, her role, and her potential. His ridicule, thinly veiled under the guise of legal authority, was an expression of unconscious bias, a manifestation of the assumptions society holds about race and gender. In his eyes, the black woman in front of him couldn't possibly hold a significant position in the legal system. Her calm demeanor, her composed silence, seemed to reinforce this idea. What else could a black woman be in this space other than a defendant or a victim, he thought. She didn't fit the image of power he was accustomed to seeing in the courtroom, power that often came with a white face, a tailored suit, and the outward display of aggression or dominance. He dismissed her, both as a woman and as a black person, reducing her to a stereotype in his mind: passive, less capable, and certainly not someone deserving of respect or recognition. It was this underestimation, this immediate categorization based on race and gender, that shaped the judge's behavior. The ridicule wasn't just about the woman herself. It was a reflection of deeper, more ingrained societal attitudes toward people of color, particularly black women. Historically, black women have been marginalized, often seen as less intelligent or less capable in professional spaces. These stereotypes have roots in centuries of racial and gender-based discrimination, where black women were denied access to education, professional roles, and the rights to be seen as equals. The judge's behavior was an echo of this broader narrative, a microcosm of the biases that continue to seep into institutional structures, including the legal system. While the judge's prejudices were on full display, The woman stood with an unshakable calm. She didn't react immediately to his ridicule, her silence seeming to speak volumes. But beneath the surface, her mind raced, processing the sting of his words. Anger simmered in her chest, but it wasn't the hot, immediate rage one might expect. It was a quiet, controlled fury, a deep-seated frustration born from years of similar moments. In a world that constantly questioned her presence in spaces of power, this was yet another reminder of the systemic racism and sexism she faced daily. But beyond the immediate sting, there was something else she was grappling with. How to remain composed in a moment that demanded a response, how to fight the urge to retaliate and instead maintain her dignity in the face of such blatant disrespect. She had fought her way to this point in her career, against every odds stacked against her. She had battled the bias that came with being a black woman in a field overwhelmingly dominated by white men. Every day had been a test of resilience, of proving that she was just as capable, just as deserving as anyone else in the room. In her silence, she was also calculating her next move. She understood, perhaps more than most, that power didn't always need to be loud. It could be subtle, it could be deliberate, and in her case, it could be transformative. This moment, though painful, would not define her. It was another test of character, another instance in a long history of challenges she had to face, and she would rise to meet it, as she always had. But this wasn't just a personal conflict. The judge's behavior, his assumptions and ridicule, was part of a much larger issue. The ongoing racial and gender discrimination that permeates the legal field and countless other professional spaces. In the courtroom, the very place where justice is supposed to prevail, bias often rears its ugly head. Women, particularly women of color, are frequently dismissed, their achievements overshadowed by stereotypes that have been built over centuries. In a 2019 report from the American Bar Association, nearly 80% of lawyers in the United States were white, and women of color represented less than 5% of all law firm equity partners. These statistics are not just numbers. They are a reflection of systemic inequality, where those who don't fit the dominant mold are often overlooked or undervalued. The judge's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that plays out daily in courtrooms across the country. The legal profession, like many others, has long struggled with issues of diversity and inclusion. Racial and gender biases affect hiring, promotion, and professional opportunities, often leaving talented individuals of color fighting against prejudices that have little to do with their qualifications or abilities. The woman in this story, however, was far more than a statistic. She was a real, living example of the fight for equity and respect. She had earned her place in this space, not just by meeting the standards set before her, but by shattering them, proving that competence and intelligence cannot and should not be measured by the color of one's skin or their gender. In this moment, the judge's ridicule was a stark reminder that despite the progress made, the biases against black women in the legal field and beyond remain entrenched. But this conflict also highlights something powerful: the courage it takes to show up day after day in spaces that are not built for you, and to keep pushing back against those who underestimate you. The black woman in this story is not simply enduring the ridicule of a judge. She is representing a larger fight for dignity and equality, one that will not be silenced. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, a subtle hum in the air that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. It wasn't until the courtroom door swung open and a new figure entered that the fragile equilibrium of the room was disturbed. A senior prosecutor, known for her calm, deliberate way of handling even the most high-profile cases, walked to the defense table and whispered a few words to the black woman standing there, who had been silently enduring the ridicule. The prosecutor's words, though hushed, carried a weight that reverberated through the room. The judge, whose earlier condescension was now met with an eerie stillness, sat at his desk, oblivious to what was coming next. For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The black woman, still composed, nodded at the prosecutor, her face a mask of controlled emotion. She stood a little straighter, as if gathering herself for what was to come. And then, without warning, the prosecutor made an announcement that shattered the facade of the judge's authority. "Your Honor, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. The woman you've been addressing is not just any attorney in this case. She is, in fact, a federal prosecutor." The words echoed in the silence, and for a fraction of a second, the courtroom was frozen in disbelief. The judge's mouth went dry. The audience gasped, and several of the lawyers in the room exchanged nervous glances. There was an audible shift, a collective recognition that something profound had just been revealed. The woman who had been at the receiving end of ridicule was not just anyone. She was a person of immense power, a person who could bring down the full weight of the law if she chose. The judge, his face now flushed with embarrassment, struggled to process what had just been said. His earlier condescension and unacknowledged bias suddenly felt like an exposed wound. The man who had believed himself to be above reproach was now confronted with the sharp sting of his own ignorance. The black woman, who had been silently underestimated, stood tall. Her poise was no longer just a defense mechanism against the ridicule she had endured. It was a declaration of her strength. She was not just enduring a moment of disrespect. She was silently waiting for this exact moment, the moment when the truth would come to light, and the world would finally recognize her for who she truly was. In that moment, the room seemed to shift. It wasn't just the judge who had to reckon with his own biases. It was the entire courtroom. The lawyers, the jurors, and the spectators. All of them had witnessed this powerful woman endure ridicule without ever once flinching, without ever once stepping out of her role. And now they knew why. They knew the woman who had been dismissed was not just an advocate for justice in the courtroom. She was the embodiment of it. As the judge sat in stunned silence, the woman's eyes met his for the first time since the ridicule had begun. There was no trace of anger or gloating in her gaze, only a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of the moment's power. She had not needed to assert herself, to claim dominance. Instead, she had allowed the truth to speak for itself. And now, as the weight of her identity settled over the judge, it was clear that the power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. The other courtroom figures, too, had their perceptions altered. Several of the jurors, who had perhaps unconsciously absorbed the same biases the judge had, looked at the woman with renewed respect. One of them, a middle-aged man with graying hair, glanced down at his notepad, scribbling something. Another juror, a woman of color, watched the scene with a slow, knowing smile. She recognized the significance of this moment, not just for the woman who had been wronged, but for the collective recognition of what it meant to defy expectations, to rise above the limitations imposed by race and gender. The other attorneys in the room, once detached and perhaps even complicit in the casual bias of the courtroom, now shifted in their seats. Some avoided eye contact with the judge, while others glanced at the woman, unsure of how to reconcile what they had just witnessed with their previous assumptions. One defense attorney, a young man who had initially dismissed the black woman's presence, leaned forward, his eyes wide in realization. Outside the courtroom, the tension continued to build as the audience processed what had just transpired. What had seemed like a typical day in court had suddenly turned into a dramatic revelation. The woman's calm composure was now seen in a new light. The long hours of preparation, the struggles to overcome every obstacle placed before her, were no longer invisible. The discovery of her true position was not just a personal vindication. It was a moment of collective reckoning, an acknowledgement of the biases that exist within the legal system and society at large. As for the judge, his mind was racing. The shame he felt wasn't immediate. It built slowly, creeping up from the pit of his stomach as he processed the magnitude of his mistake. He had ridiculed her, belittled her, assuming she had no place in the halls of power. He had dismissed her without a second thought, relying on assumptions he didn't even know he held. And now, Those assumptions had been exposed, as had the extent of his own ignorance. The weight of the revelation was not lost on him. His pride, so firmly held just moments before, now felt like a hollow shell. Was he ashamed of his behavior? Absolutely. But more than that, he was forced to confront a deeper question. How many times had he done this before? How many other people, not just this woman, had he unjustly dismissed in his career? How many had never had the chance to reveal their true selves, their true power? This moment, though awkward and embarrassing, was forcing him to examine his entire worldview. For the black woman, however, there was little to celebrate. The vindication was there, but it was tempered by the complexities of the moment. She had faced down the judge's ridicule with grace, but now, her victory felt somewhat hollow. She had been forced to prove herself, to reveal her identity in a way that felt both humiliating and necessary. While the judge had learned a hard lesson, she knew that this was just one moment in a long history of challenges she would face. It wasn't the first time her identity had been questioned, nor would it be the last. But for now, in this courtroom at this moment, she had won, not through confrontation, but through the quiet power of truth. And though the path ahead was far from easy, she knew this moment would serve as a reminder of who she was and what she had already overcome. The courtroom, still echoing with the weight of the revelation, was now a space of heightened tension, but also, surprisingly, a potential starting point for change. The moment of discovery had irrevocably altered the dynamics of power between the judge and the black woman. But what would happen next? Would the judge continue to hide behind his biases, or would he acknowledge the wrongness of his actions? Would the black woman feel vindicated, or would she, too, have to contend with the complexities of what had just transpired? The judge's internal struggle. The judge sat at his bench, his hands now resting awkwardly on the polished wood. His thoughts were a swirl of confusion, regret, and disbelief. He had not prepared for this moment. In his mind, he had always held the power. He had always been in control. Now, everything he had believed about himself and the systems he upheld was being questioned. He was not just embarrassed, he was ashamed. How many other times had he dismissed someone like this woman? How many others had he treated unfairly based on the same flawed assumptions? His earlier actions now felt like an embodiment of the systemic racism and bias that had, for too long, defined the legal system in unspoken ways. His hand hovered over the gavel for a moment, but he did not strike it. Instead, he cleared his throat, trying to gather his thoughts. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on him, waiting for some form of acknowledgement. For the first time in his career, the weight of his position seemed unbearable. He knew what was expected of him. He could either double down on his authority, maintaining the facade of superiority that he had so long relied on, or he could confront his own biases head-on. The judge stood slowly, his posture now stooped, as if the weight of his actions was physically pulling him down. He looked directly at the black woman, meeting her eyes for the first time since the ridicule. There was no longer any disdain in his gaze, only an unspoken acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. His voice, once booming and authoritative, now carried a tone of humility and regret. "I owe you an apology," he began, his words quiet but firm. "What I said earlier was inexcusable. I misjudged you, and in doing so, I misjudged myself. I allowed my assumptions and my biases to cloud my judgment, and that is something I deeply regret." The words, while seemingly simple, hung heavy in the air. For a moment, the woman did not respond. She did not immediately accept his apology, nor did she dismiss it. Instead, she stood, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable. She had been waiting for this moment, not because it would change anything in the long term, but because it was the first step towards something larger, something that needed to happen not just in this courtroom, but in every space where systemic biases had taken root. The judge continued, this time with a more visible sense of vulnerability. "I've spent my career trying to uphold the law, but today I failed to see the law for what it really is, a tool that must be wielded justly and without prejudice. What I've learned today is that justice cannot be dispensed with a closed mind, and it cannot thrive in a system that turns a blind eye to its own failings. It was clear to the woman that the judge was not simply apologizing for his actions. He was undergoing a process of self-reflection that was, in its own way, transformative. She could feel the sincerity in his words, but there was also something else, a discomfort, an acknowledgement that the apology alone was not enough to rectify the harm that had been done. The black woman's response was measured, calm, but also pointed. "Your apology is noted, but it is not enough," she said, her voice steady and unyielding. "I've been underestimated my whole career. But that's not what this is about. What I want to see, and what I will continue to push for, is not just apologies but change. Change in how the system views people like me. Change in how power is distributed. Change in how people of color and women are treated, not just in the courtroom, but in every professional space." Her words were not a challenge, but a call to action. She had never expected a single apology to change anything. She had not entered the courtroom hoping for recognition or a moment of vindication. What mattered to her was the larger fight, the fight for equity and respect in every facet of society. It was this fight that had driven her to become a federal prosecutor, and it was this fight that would continue to shape her path forward. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "What I would ask of you, Judge, is not to be defensive or make excuses. I don't need you to justify your actions. I need you to understand that this is bigger than us. It's about a system that needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, one that stops judging people by the color of their skin or the assumptions attached to their gender or background." For a moment, the judge stood in silence, processing her words. He understood now that his apology, however heartfelt, was only a small part of the larger conversation. This wasn't just about him and her. It was about all the invisible barriers that had existed unnoticed for years. It was about dismantling the prejudices that had long been woven into the fabric of the legal system, not just for the black woman before him, but for everyone who had been oppressed or marginalized. The moment in that courtroom would not be a single point of resolution. Instead, it was a pivotal step in the broader movement for systemic reform. Over the following weeks, the conversation expanded beyond the walls of the courtroom. News outlets picked up on the story, and soon the public was engaged in heated discussions about the treatment of women and people of color in professional spaces. Legal scholars, activists, and community leaders weighed in, calling for accountability and transparency in the judiciary and beyond. The black woman, once hidden in the shadows of unspoken assumptions, became a symbol for change. Her story was not unique. It was the story of countless others who had endured similar disrespect and bias without the chance to confront it head-on. In the aftermath of the courtroom confrontation, the judge found himself in a position he had never been in before, one of introspection and accountability. He sought out professional development and training in unconscious bias and diversity, not because he was being forced to, but because he recognized that change was necessary, not just for his own personal growth, but for the future of the legal profession. He made public statements acknowledging the need for greater awareness and action in the legal system, using his position to advocate for more equitable practices. The black woman, while still committed to her career, began to advocate more actively for diversity and inclusion within the legal field. She became involved in mentorship programs for young women and people of color, using her position to support others who had faced similar struggles. Her actions, grounded in a belief that the system needed to change, began to influence those around her. Slowly, through grassroots efforts and continued professional advocacy, she was able to spark conversations about equality that reverberated throughout the legal community. As the judge and the black woman moved forward, their personal transformations rippled outward. The judge's self-reflection became a catalyst for other legal professionals to examine their own biases and assumptions. Some of his colleagues, who had once turned a blind eye to these issues, began to engage in uncomfortable but necessary conversations about the ways in which the system had failed to protect those most vulnerable. The black woman, now recognized as both a fierce advocate and a symbol of resilience, continued her work in the courtroom, but she was also instrumental in shaping a new narrative about race, gender, and power in the legal system. She helped to lead the charge for reforms that made the system more transparent, more inclusive, and more aware of its failings. This shift, though gradual, became part of a larger societal movement. People who had once been passive witnesses to injustice now began to speak out, to demand change, and to recognize the importance of confronting their own biases. In the end, the moment of ridicule had transformed into a turning point, not just for the judge or the black woman, but for the legal system as a whole. It was a moment of reckoning, and it would be remembered as the beginning of a new chapter in the fight for justice, equity, and respect for all. The transformation that had unfolded in the courtroom that day was just the beginning. What had started as an unexpected confrontation between two individuals, the judge and the black woman, had rippled outward, touching not just their personal lives, but the very structure of the legal system and, in a broader sense, the societal attitudes toward race, power, and justice. The impact of this moment would stretch far beyond the courtroom, affecting the judge, the black woman, and the community at large. The judge's life, once defined by certainty in his own authority and the belief in the unflinching fairness of the legal system, had been irreversibly altered. No longer could he turn a blind eye to the biases that had shaped his actions, or, more disturbingly, the way he had dismissed others. The day of the black woman's revelation marked the first step in his long journey towards self-reflection and accountability. In the months that followed, the judge's behavior changed permanently. He sought out professional development in diversity, inclusion, and unconscious bias, not as a response to a mandate, but as a personal commitment to growth. It was difficult at times. There were moments of discomfort, moments where he wanted to justify his past actions. But he resisted. He kept an open mind and participated in dialogues about systemic inequality, especially in the legal system. He attended seminars on how implicit biases operate within legal frameworks and how they affect sentencing, witness credibility, and jury decisions. Publicly, the judge became a staunch advocate for policy reform. His previous remarks about the black woman, once an example of the insidiousness of racial prejudice in the courtroom, became a source of his public accountability. He openly apologized for his actions in a press conference, acknowledging that his position had shielded him from understanding the pervasive biases that plagued the system. His apology was sincere, but it was also paired with concrete actions. He introduced a proposal for diversity training within his court, one that required every judge, attorney, and legal staff member to participate in ongoing education about race, privilege, and systemic inequality. Beyond his professional life, the judge took his newfound awareness into the public sphere. He used his platform to speak about the long-standing impact of racism in the judicial system and called for legislative action to address racial disparities in sentencing, bail practices, and incarceration rates. His stance wasn't popular with everyone. There were still voices in the legal community who resisted change. But those voices were growing quieter, outpaced by the growing number of people who recognized that true justice could only be achieved when biases were acknowledged and eliminated. One of the most significant steps the judge took was his involvement in local community outreach. He became a vocal supporter of mentorship programs for young people of color who wanted to pursue careers in law. He worked with nonprofit organizations that provided legal services to underserved communities, ensuring that legal representation wasn't just for the privileged few. His long-standing belief that the law was impartial now had to be reshaped into an understanding that the law itself needed to be reformed to ensure that it worked impartially for everyone. The lasting impact of the judge's transformation was palpable. He had gone from someone who had dismissed the significance of bias to someone actively working to eliminate those biases within the system. His journey was not easy, and it was far from complete, but it was a beginning, a sign that even those who perpetuate injustice can, with reflection and effort, evolve. His story, once marked by personal prejudice, became an example of how individuals in positions of power can change when confronted with their own wrongdoings and when they commit to real action. For the Black woman, the aftermath of the courtroom revelation was no less transformative, though it was less about personal growth and more about continued activism and change on a larger scale. She had always understood the legal system as flawed. After all, she had been the victim of its biases for much of her career. But the experience in the courtroom showed her that the road to systemic reform was longer and more complicated than she had hoped. Still, she was determined. Her professional trajectory was forever altered after the moment of revelation. The case that had initially made her a subject of ridicule had become the catalyst for her to elevate her voice even further. She became a figurehead in the ongoing conversation about race and justice in the legal field. Through public speaking engagements, interviews, and participation in legal panels, she continued to challenge the structures that upheld racial inequality. She didn't simply seek a place at the table. She fought to change the table itself. The Black woman's work extended far beyond individual cases and courtroom battles. She advocated for sweeping changes in legal education, calling for law schools to adopt curricula that not only addressed legal theory, but also confronted systemic inequality, racial biases, and the need for lawyers and judges to be actively anti-racist. She championed policies that would increase the representation of people of color in law schools, in judicial appointments, and across the legal profession. She began working with national organizations that sought to bring transparency to law enforcement, focusing on how police brutality and racial profiling intersected with the courts. She also helped create training programs for legal professionals that addressed unconscious bias and the importance of empathetic, fair decision-making in the courtroom. Her efforts were not without resistance. Many in the legal profession saw her as a threat to the established order, one that had been comfortable in its inequities. But for every opponent she faced, there were others who stood with her. Young lawyers of color, law students, and activists found in her an unwavering source of inspiration. They began to speak out, to challenge the same prejudices that had once silenced her. Her story, one of resilience in the face of discrimination, became a beacon for others who had long felt that their voices were too small, too overlooked, or too insignificant to make a difference. Even as she pushed for change in the legal system, the Black woman never lost sight of the individual stories that had driven her. She mentored young people who had been affected by the very biases she had fought, sharing with them not just legal strategies, but the wisdom of someone who had endured and triumphed over the injustices they now faced. Her work was a constant balancing act between pushing for structural reform and remembering the human cost of the systems that continued to perpetuate inequality. She knew that the road to justice was long, but she was determined to walk it, one step at a time, for as long as it took. The encounter between the judge and the Black woman became a landmark moment in the broader conversation about race and justice in America. The case sparked a wave of public outcry, followed by dialogues that spanned communities, legal circles, and political platforms. News outlets, social media, and activist groups rallied around the story, demanding that the biases that had been so openly revealed be addressed at the highest levels of government and in every branch of law. In some states, the conversation led to tangible action. Legislative bodies began to introduce bills that addressed racial disparities in sentencing and prison reform. Some legal institutions pushed for more rigorous diversity training and the implementation of anti-bias initiatives. These changes, while small, were a direct result of the ripple effect created by the Black woman's fight for justice in that courtroom. At the same time, the public's understanding of racial injustice in the legal system deepened. The judge's apology, though important, was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a shift in how people viewed systemic racism and how they understood the responsibility of those in positions of power to confront it. activists and community leaders used the moment to call for further changes in law enforcement, legal practices, and societal attitudes toward race and power. As the story of the judge and the black woman spread, it became clear that the moment in that courtroom was not an isolated event. It was a symbol of the potential for transformation, both on an individual and societal level. Their encounter served as a reminder that confronting bias, challenging stereotypes, and taking responsibility for one's actions was not just an individual act. It was a societal imperative. The story left the audience with a call to action, an invitation to join the fight for justice, not just as passive witnesses, but as active participants. The change that had begun in that courtroom was still in its early stages, but it was far from over. There was still much work to be done, but as the judge and the black woman had shown, transformation was possible. It was difficult. It was messy, but it was essential. And so, as the curtain fell on this chapter, the audience was left with a profound sense of inspiration. The journey toward justice and equality was ongoing, but it was a journey that could and would be shaped by those who dared to confront their biases and take responsibility for creating a better world.